They will lie. They will do anything. Lie, deflect to sidetrack what looks to be the apparent truth. And this is all about for the population that they screwed up. And it is just another indication of how off the rails this regime is.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen. And today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with Peter Zwack, a retired brigadier general who served for 34 years in the US Army as an intelligence officer before becoming the US's senior defense attaché to the Russian Federation between 2012 and 2014. It's always a pleasure, General Zwack. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you for having me, James, and it is great to be speaking to your viewers. I view the UK as the indispensable ally for us and friends.
Well, we always appreciate your insights and your expertise on Frontline. Let's begin with events of recent days and obviously the tragic killing of at least 137 concert goers in Moscow on Friday. What is interesting is the fallout from that and the Kremlin, without any evidence, accusing Ukraine of having some involvement. It's a shocking tactic. I suppose, sadly, it's not a surprising tactic from Vladimir Putin. What do you make of it?
When I heard this and the details were still opaque, I said to myself, I'm sure the Russians will find a spin at Ukraine and use this as a narrative to deflect the potential blame on the regime for not paying attention to warnings out there, maybe focusing too much effort on its security services on popular dissent, and I think the regime is embarrassed now. Being the nature of that Russian regime, I think we can all say they will lie. They will do anything. Lie, deflect to sidetrack what looks to be the apparent truth. And this is all about for the population that they screwed up. And it is just another indication of how off the rails this regime is. Apparently, and I don't know the back and forth of the inner details, but as we say, there was, we have in, I think, some of the Western intelligence service, a sense of duty on anti-terrorism, and we may be at each other's throats in other ways, but on anti-terrorism, this is a shared, awful threat, and we share information. And on March 7th, it is indicative that the U.S. Embassy warned its own people to be careful in Moscow environs of a potential terrorist threat. Now, they wouldn't have published that without telling the Russians first. And for whatever reasons, the Russians were, it's tragic, asleep at the switch. These people out there that were killed were innocent. I mean, they're civilians. And they're not, part of the bigger checkerboard of Ukraine and everything else. But what does concern me is, again, how Putin and the regime and the media over there is now painting making a portrayal that these guys were trying to escape into Ukraine, had links, and I could see right out of Stalin and Beria, and that they are going to force a confession, quotes, out of one of these terrorists, which they are, that the Ukrainians were behind it.
That's a really interesting point. I wanted to ask you about the scenes we saw yesterday of the 4 suspects being led into court. One was in a wheelchair, one of them apparently missing an eye. The other 3 had clearly been, it would seem, assaulted by intelligence officers under interrogation. That is reminiscent, as you say, of something you might have seen in the Stalin era, back in the dark days of the Soviet Union. Of course, we've spoken before, Peter, about the fact that you started working in Russia towards the tail end of the Soviet Union, and you'd worked in the country for many years. Did you think we had left that behind? Does it surprise you that we are seeing, it would appear, those tactics again?
I'm more sad and disappointed that we left, that we moved beyond, that we haven't been able to move on past the dark histories, and they seem to be bubbling up an ever increasing form. Back in the late 80s and 90s, the time I wrote my book Swimming the Volga, the Russians were really getting at its past and calling out the crimes of Stalin and the NKVD and the just the nature, the savage domestic nature of the Soviet regime, even as it proclaims its greatness and power and everything else like that. And then we saw during the Yeltsin years it chip away, and then Putin comes into power in 2000. The beginning, it starts slow, but he's rocked early on. He's rocked by major terror incidents. We may all remember the Nordost Theater, where in Moscow, where 130 are killed in a gigantic hostage crisis, and Islamists and the Russian the Spetsnaz go in to save them and gas a bunch of their own people, and 130 people die. And then there is the Beslan. We all remember the horrible Beslan school incident in North Ossetia near Georgia, the Caucasus, where Chechens, it would look to be, were involved in a awful hostage situation where 330 people were killed in May of 2004. This is early Putin. So he's formed, with the Chechens and the Chechens and the various Islamists. You had the St. Petersburg metro attack, and I make this point because it was a suicide bomber as late as 2017 from Kyrgyzstan. And these guys, and 15 people are killed. And then there are a number of other attacks in between. And so you see that whether it is ISIS or other Islamic groups associated with Chechnya and others, this guy was from Kyrgyzstan, as it looks to be these 4, if these are the 4, from Tajikistan. So the recruits for ISIS-K and international terror don't just come from Afghanistan in the Middle East. They're increasingly from the Central Asia, again, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and others. And they are semi-internal. They speak Russian. So the Russians have got a problem, a lot of which they brought on themselves. Now, the last thing, the Russians have also been fighting ISIS and international terror, and quite brutally, it's a nasty fight any way you take it, in Syria, and there have been a lot of death in Syria, both of ISIS and innocent civilians, and this all plays. So while all this stuff with the US and NATO and Ukraine is going on, what is interesting is that in a quiet that it always starts quiet, parallel track. Think about, a little bit before 9/11, there are things going on a parallel track, but then boom. And this is a big deal. This is Moscow, international news. The security, I mean, quick response was non-existent in the beginning. These guys had the run of the place. And these big sort of theater complexes are quite modern. They're quite, and I can see a lot of just normal Russians, well-heeled Russians, out for a nice concert, being caught up in this awful situation. Putin will not accept fault for this. And this is what makes the Ukraine thing particularly worrisome, James, is that this may stoke a retaliation, quote unquote, and coming up with a false flag or false narrative to deflect, as I've started in our discussion, is probably more likely than not. So stay tuned. Meanwhile, with all this going on, and you've got the heaviest round of missile and drone strikes in and around Kyiv in 2 years, and throughout Ukrainian critical infrastructure, and this starts before this terrorist attack, but it certainly will, that may exacerbate it as Russia lashes out at Ukraine for a number of different reasons.
What you raise there is a really salient point about what we've seen over recent days in Kyiv, this very, very heavy bombardment of the city. And I wonder if you can just compare, from your analysis, how Ukrainian air defenses are performing in comparison to Russian air defenses, because it feels like we're now seeing some pretty significant developments behind the front line, both on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. We're also seeing Ukraine have continued success with the Black Sea Fleet. Apparently over the weekend, 2 more landing ships in the Black Sea were struck, I think, by a couple of Ukrainian missiles, Storm Shadow. And then also we've seen an oil depot as well in Russia being targeted. So how would you sum up the relative strengths of the Russian air defenses compared to the Ukrainian?
Yeah, it's a critical fight. A number of while the Ukrainians knocked down most of the Russian missiles and drones, a number of them got through, and some critical infrastructure was knocked out. The good news is that Ukraine is in mid-March, and this isn't mid-January, so they're coming out of deep winter. But it's the whole situation. If I could pull it back, James, if you were to ask me to describe the war right now, I would say that it is in a deep, grinding stalemate along the major front, except the Black Sea, where the Russians have gained some momentum along the fight along the front, and taking little nibbles and bites, costly bites out of the Ukrainian line, not big ones, but it's attritional, and this is the part that worries many of us, is this grinding attritional fight. Ukrainians are better, but the Russians have improved. But they have not a massive, but a significant firepower edge in things as mundane as we all been reading about it, just artillery shells. And for them, it's 152 millimeter or 122 millimeter. For us, for the Ukrainians, it's 155 millimeter, which is what feeds those M77 howitzers and other relatively new pieces we fed. And the Ukrainians are quite effective with artillery, but they have to be careful and ration and husband their rounds, while the Russians are able to fire torrents of rounds into the area. We've read about it. Avdiivka, the Russians had um, brought in air glided bombs, glide bombs, 1.5 tons apiece that can be released by aircraft 50 kilometers behind the line, and then kind of sort of vector in. It isn't precision, but it is in the area, and those things absolutely were shaking the Ukrainian defense around Avdiivka, and that's another reason. So when the Russians have the Ukrainians in a, when I say mano a mano static line, then it is an ugly for the UK. It's like, you know, the Ukrainian Russian, the Somme in 2016, or Verdun, the Ukrainians are giving their measure, but they're taking significant losses too. And you wonder at a certain point, imagine a number of how long can this continue, which is so important. Why, so importantly, we, the United States and our allies, need to continue to support them any which way we can. We have a political issue in my country. I apologize for it. We'll get there. It's great to see that Europe has really, really stepped up in the last few months. But this is and I may have mentioned it in our last sessions, what I worry about, James, is not just the Ukrainians fighting along this grind, and yes, but in some way losing hope that this is going to be any break from this just endless attack, counterattack grind that are killing, you know, tens of thousands of Russians and fives of thousands of Ukrainians. That's too many Ukrainians still. And there seemed to be no end. The Black Sea, you touched on, is there'll be history books written about that one. It is a masterclass in asymmetry, in the indirect approach, and as you mentioned, the recent landing ships. They have turned the Western Black Sea into a Ukrainian lake without even a single Ukrainian capital ship. By sea skimmer drones and precision airstrikes, they've been able to use the long-range missiles they have, especially Storm Shadow, which is what I believe destroyed can you believe this? The Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters a number of months ago in Sevastopol, in Crimea. How amazing was that? So it is a grinded out stalemate, momentum to Russia. The Ukrainians are very much still in the fight, giving more than they're taking. But it is how is there an end in sight to this? Is probably how I would think about the Ukrainian population and the worry. They're thinking about a call up. They've been trying to protect their youth under 25. And there may be a call up to get more people and younger people into the fight.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, General, is whether we're seeing any change in the targets that Russia are choosing. Specifically, are they now going after civilian population centers more as opposed to some of the energy infrastructure, whereas Ukraine are clearly targeting places like this oil depot, going after Russian energy infrastructure? Are we starting to see Russia deliberately targeting population centers more than they were before?
I think they were doing it before, and they get a twofer. They get to get a double bonus if they can get an infrastructure target in a civilian area, and then they can say we were going after the infrastructure. And this, where you touched on it, is where the air defense is critical. The Ukrainian air defense has been remarkable over the last 2 years. I mean, pulled it together. A lot of help from the West, organic systems too. But they also are worried about running out of air defense rounds, for both for the long range shooters like Patriots, but as basic as stingers and blowtorches and things like that. And I think maybe that might be, and it's supposition, one reason more Russian missiles are getting through, as the Ukrainians are having to increasingly husband their air defense rounds, hoping more will be coming in the pipeline.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is Poland demanding now an explanation from the Kremlin after a Russian missile briefly strayed into Polish airspace during a missile attack on Kiev the other day. It caused Poland to need to briefly activate F-16 fighter jets in response. Obviously, Poland being part of NATO. What do you make of that?
Well, what it looks like, it was, I believe it was a Russian mistake, but it doesn't matter. It happened, and you had a Russian missile, probably the KH-55 variety, with quite a long range, 1,000 kilometers, fired from a Bear bomber, which would be either in north of the border. They will fly them off of the border. Early in the war, they were flying over Belarus and firing over that, but we haven't heard that. Or standoff in the backside of Crimea. Bottom line is that they were fired. It looks like one of the missiles they were aiming at Lviv, which is an extraordinary Ukrainian city. It's a lot like Krakow in Poland. It's beautiful. It's one of the only cities that survived World War II. It's beautiful. Austro-Hungarian. I'm sorry, I'm in the sidebar. But one of the missiles apparently looks to have gone stray, and and how I'm parsing it is somehow it entered Ukrainian airspace. Polish airspace. People are saying was in it for 39 seconds, and then somehow the course came out of the airspace. I don't know. Bottom line is that it's dangerous. Remember the incident last year when there was fragments of a knockdown Russian missile or parts of a Ukrainian missile that fell in Poland, and 2 people were killed, and a lot of back and forth on that. The bottom line here, the significance is we're dealing with an Article 5 power in Poland, in NATO, and it won't tolerate these type of things if they point a specific blame. So, and this is one way to inadvertently embroil Russia and NATO into something that I think neither side wants. But tensions are up. People are edgy, and mistakes happen. So complaints were filed and all that, but the missile did apparently leave Polish airspace. It seems to look like it flew through and out.
And just finally, Peter, if we zoom out a bit and look at the wider context of the war, what do you think are the key things that, as an analyst, you will be looking for to see the direction in which this conflict is heading? What will you be paying attention to in the next few weeks and months?
Well, I first of all, I'm looking, and I believe they will. I think the key piece is that Ukraine stays like bedrock in its defense. It'll have bad days. It'll have good days. But that the core ability to Ukraine to fight with assistance, but fight for its existential survival, and is not in any way internally shaken by this. That's one. Two, finding a way to take the pressure off this grinding, nibble by nibble Russian offensive that is just, across the front, that is doing the attrition that we talked about. Three, I believe it's as much psychological as material, a belief that the free-minded world, because it isn't just Europe and us, the free-minded world will stick with Ukraine through this crisis, through thick and thin. That is the morale aspect. You can't put a number, a quantity on morale and spirit. And if they know that the world is behind them and supporting them, they will stay at the fight. The ability for the West, certainly my country, the U.S. and its and the other allies and free-minded nations, to continue to support the in the necessary weapons to take the war to the Russians. I think that is foundational, and or else we risk the Russians just with their call up of reserves and hundreds of thousands of more coming, and more weapons and rockets and missiles, a number of them coming from Iran, and millions of artillery shells, can you believe it, from North Korea and elsewhere, that as I mentioned, that the ability to just withstand the Russian grind. And then in the big world, politically, what will it take to get much of the world that Russia has successfully wooed with its break, or Europe's break with Russia, to its south. We call the global south, but other countries that are actively, like Iran, and to a lesser extent China, Korea, and then the nations, even in India, accepting oil and gas and not taking a collective position against continued Russian aggression, now entering a third year. These all play. And then finally, and I don't want to be self-serving as an American, but our 2024 November election is really important, because that will chart a course for us, and I believe we're going to make it. But it's nerve-wracking, and what is interesting is we know that Europe and the Ukrainians and other countries. I was just in Georgia 10 days ago in Tbilisi for a security conference. You think they're watching? Russia took a chunk out of them in 2008 and gobbled up South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Well, the Ukrainians worry that if the Russians succeed, and succeed could be gaining territory what is up to their satisfaction since the war began in 2022, or actually defeating entirely the Ukrainian government, then they're next on the menu. Meaning the Russians finish what they did in 2008, and then the follow-on stories. People are worried about Moldova and all of that, and I'm worried about all of that too. But for the Russians to get away with an aggression and have a perception of victory is emboldens. This is a more than authoritarian nation now, and it is on the march. It's emboldened by and the Putin election. By the way, this awful attack. And again, the civilians are innocent. In Moscow just now, the terrorist attack takes the wind considerably out of the hype and the chest thumping and the nationalist pride of Putin's election. And what was interesting that came out, and I say this to you and your audience, what came out as particularly menacing, though we've heard this before in many forms, is that don't forget, you guys in the West, US and all that, may look at, I'm paraphrasing, Ukraine as sort of a tactical thing to block us or to mess with us, whatever, our righteous thing. But he said, don't forget that Ukraine is existential for us. It's existential for the Russians. And on the margins of that, left and right, is all the narrative and hype about nukes, nuclear weapons. And they do, and the Russians do that to intimidate. It's nuclear intimidation. It doesn't work like it used to, but it's still concerning. And I mean, and even when and they, for example, shot back with that when President Macron threw out those surprising comments. Well, there might be, European or NATO boots in the ground in Ukraine if this goes this way, and of course, shocked a lot of NATO, but I think it shocked Putin even more, and then immediately goes and plays the nuclear card, and that's always out there. They are superpower militarily, first and foremost, because of their nuclear weapons. Their military has proven to be quite pedestrian, but I caution it's much improved. And maybe that's the last point, is that that there has been also innovation on the Russian side. With everything from drones and electronic warfare, there's negated some of our weapons. So the Russians are better than they were, and there's a lot being learned on both sides of the front in Ukraine. I think all the militaries that are interested in are watching this intently. The lessons learned are voluminous and still coming, and the tragedy is that lessons learned are over the bodies of many Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, and even Russians that have no idea what's going on, but they're being thrown into the fray.
Peter, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
All right, all the best, and again, you guys are our paramount ally.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel, listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.